everyone, and welcome to the Women Know Your Place webinar series. Thank you for joining us this morning. Women know Your Place, isn't that a little bit cheeky? Well, yes, I think it is actually. But really, I think it's time we understood the effects of the decisions that we make and the impact that they have on our life. Today, we look at one of the most important aspects of why women need to have a seat at the financial decision-making table, and the incredibly devastating effect that ill-planned estates can have on a family. What is 100% certain is that we're all going to pass away one day. This involves planning, as a simple will stating that everything you own passes directly to your hubby and vice versa just isn't really sufficient. Picture the scene. Suddenly your world changes, and it's all so very hard. The first few moments, weeks, months, are so much more than you anticipated. There are seemingly insurmountable number of decisions to be made, mostly about money. Your significant other has unexpectedly passed away, and you're left with a very real aftermath of how this estate is going to be wound up. And then the nightmare begins, because you find that the estate is frozen, and you cannot access any of the funds from the bank. Phone call after phone call, and you suddenly become aware that you're having to ask friends for money to help you out. You can't even pay for the funeral. The house has to be sold because no one looked to see how the actual nuts and bolts of all of this was going to work. Estate duty, executive fees, bond closures, and just keeping the lights on really start to play up. Yet we seem to all have wills with one line saying, I'm just leaving everything to my hubby. I mean, wrapping up an estate is really tying up all the loose ends of somebody's life, their full life. And yet we have a one-liner. I leave everything to my hubby. I leave everything to my wife. 2 years later, and there's still no clarity. And I really have to ask the question, does it actually have to be like this? Well, no, it doesn't actually. Many of our clients have really complicated estates. They have offshore and onshore investments, companies, trusts. They might have an ex-wife and children from a previous marriage. There might be parents that need to be taken care of. And each and every member of the family is at a different life stage in terms of the requirements that they have. So today we look at exactly this, how to wrap up an estate efficiently and effectively, considering all the various aspects that need to be taken into consideration. And I have with me Leslie Swart from Carrick Consult. Thank you so much for joining us today, Leslie.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So Leslie, 74% of women die single, and that's a shocking stat. And I think just to start with, I wanted to ask you how many of your clients that you've come across where their estate planning has just not been done correctly?
Sure, no, it's a good question. But I think let's just pause for a second to just determine what we mean by estate planning. So like you mentioned, most people, once they've done their will and they've drafted a will and it's signed properly and it's in the safe, they consider their estate planning to be done. It is a bit of a misconception that estate planning involves getting your will signed. It goes a little bit further than that, because the will is the ultimate document that will say what happens to your estate when you pass away. But a lot of planning needs to go into having this 3 or 4 pages of paper signed. So estate planning is not only telling someone what your wishes are, it's actually to decide whether your wishes are going to be effective. So it looks at your assets. Where are your assets? How are you married? We touched on the marital regimes in our previous webinar. So how are you married? What does your family structure look like? Do you have minor children? Do you have siblings that you care for? Do you have elderly parents that you care for? Where are your assets? Are they local or they offshore? What debts do you have? And, do you have sufficient cash? Like you mentioned, do you have sufficient cash to pay for the funeral? Do you have enough cash to pay for the groceries, etc.? So a lot of the planning needs to be done to get to the 3 pages that will ultimately record your wishes. And if we look at estate planning from that point of view, there are very few of our clients that have this in place, where they have a roadmap of where, almost like a little bit of a diagram of where all the assets are, and then a roadmap from where we are now and where do we want to be. And it sounds very morbid to talk about death, but I mean, that's the two sure things in life is death and taxes.
Yes,
And
exactly.
they play such a huge role in our planning. And obviously you want to leave the best for your children and for your beneficiaries.
Yeah.
So the short answer to your question is no. Very few of our clients have this roadmap ready and work according to that. And life changes. So it's a roadmap that's valid for now. But like you said, sometimes life throws you a curveball and you need to be able to adjust that roadmap of yours to suit your circumstances.
I love the way you put that, Leslie. I mean, I think when I think about estate planning, I do tend to think of just a will. And from what you're saying, it actually needs to be constantly updated because, of course, life changes and you've got children that are growing older. So now they no longer need to be taken into, taken care of from a school perspective, but rather university. And things are changing. How often do you need to really update your will, or is this roadmap a process that really covers all of those different aspects?
So if you have your planning in place, obviously, whenever there's a big life event, something like you decide you're going to immigrate, it has a huge impact. If there's another child, it's a big impact. If you get divorced, it's a big impact. But it is a good thing to almost have a little bit of a reminder that once a year, just have a quick quiz on what's changed in your life. It might not be necessary for your will to be updated because if your planning is in place and your will speaks to your planning, it might be little tweaks and twists in your planning side which might not affect your will. However, it is good to be aware, like we all do a regular blood pressure check or we go for some medical checks every year. If you're part of a financial institution, you need kind of been forced to go and do your physical checks every year. So this should be part of your tick box for every year to say, listen, just touch base. What's changed in my life? Is it necessary for me to update my will? Is it just making sure that everything is still where it should be? So I would say at least every second year, but if it could be an annual thing, it would be great.
Amazing. Okay, that's really good to think about it from that aspect, actually. And for me, poor estate planning really articulates itself in the erosion of wealth, and the devastation of not being able to really access wealth that loved ones have passed on to you. Can you give me some ideas of what can happen if a client really hasn't taken into consideration in planning for this event?
Okay.
And I just want to say further to that, and I'm really aware that it is a planning process moving from working to retirement to passing on your estate. It is actually something you have to plan for. It's not something that one just goes into, essentially, if you're going to do it correctly.
So we've looked at a lot of facts and history, and wealth really lasts for 3 generations if there's not proper planning. So you'll have generation 1 who starts off maybe a bit lower and work their way up. They might be entrepreneurs, businessmen or businesswomen, and they build up their wealth. And the second generation grows up watching mom and dad work very hard, spending hours at work, giving them their all to build up this wealth. So when the second generation kind of takes over the wealth, they want to preserve it because they saw how hard their parents had to work to build this wealth that they inherited. So they also still work hard, but they don't work as hard as generation 1 because they now have some wealth to work with, but they're very keen on preserving. The problem comes in when this wealth now goes over to generation 3, if there's not proper planning and proper structuring, because generation 3 was born into wealth. They did not see the hours it took for grandfather, grandmother to build this wealth, and it comes easy for them. So we then tend to see that wealth kind of slides down in generation 3 because they're just so used to having it. They don't need to work so hard, which means then by the time you get to generation 4, you're actually back to generation 1. So we always say that if you do your planning properly and you get your family involved early on in the planning stage, they understand why certain things are done in a certain manner. It just helps the wealth that was hard earned last for a lot longer. And then also with planning, we make sure that obviously the dreaded estate duty, no planning should just revolve around tax planning, but there is a way of, be so efficient in your planning structure. You don't want to, generation after generations, let 20% of your wealth go to taxes. So that's part of our planning. So you need to look at your family, what's good for them, and then look at not losing too much wealth along the way, passing it over to the next generation.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think it plays into one of my biggest fears, especially with Carrick, Athena, and trying to help women understand why it's so important to get invested and why it's so important to have a seat at the family financial decision-making table, because it's not only necessarily passing wealth from one generation to the next, it's actually passing wealth within the family. And I read the statistic the other day that I think it was 70% of women leave their husband's financial planner within the year of his passing. And that means that they tend to break down all the structures that have been put in place. As women, we're very conservative in terms of our investments. And so what we'll do is because we are quite doubtful that we understand how investments work, we'll take that entire wealth structure, break it down, and put it into a money market savings account, which is lagging behind inflation, which means that wealth is just going to simply erode. So planning and understanding from an entire family's perspective to understand why certain things have been put in place, what the thinking was, and as a family unit to have made those decisions together, I think is really just so important and speaks to what you're saying. I've had many clients in the past year whose spouses have passed on, and it's been quite traumatic, actually. I'm just mainly so shocked to see how long it takes to wrap up the estates. I mean, I do understand that it's an entire life that you're closing off, but it just seems like it's so unfair because the person who's remaining behind is left with trying to wrap these things up and trying to sort things out, and it just takes forever, and they don't even really have time to grieve, which is so sad. Can you advise why it takes so long? And to speak to that, just going back to what I was saying at the beginning of the webinar, I know that many of our clients have quite complicated estates, so they've got offshore and they've got onshore investments, they've got trusts. As I said earlier, there may be an ex-wife, so maybe there's maintenance payments that need to be made to that ex-wife, or children that need to be taken care of. There may be parents as well who now need to, or weren't even considered to be needing care or help, but now do. And then just the various life stages. I think about the elderly going into care homes and just how enormously expensive that is. And if you're dealing with that and children, and so that whole process is really, really quite complicated.
Yeah, so the biggest problem with a deceased estate is we obviously have to work with state institutions that we have no control over. So you have the master's office. Every single person who passes away, the estate needs to be reported to the master's office. And then the master will issue letters of executorship to the nominated executor. And the deceased estate process of winding up someone's affairs only starts when the letters of executorship has been issued, because then the executor can start contacting the banks and taking control of assets. And then the next portion of where there are many delays are with the banks themselves. The banks are supposed to give a certificates of balance to state at a date of death this person had these bank accounts and these were the balances in these bank accounts. And then from there, those bank accounts need to be closed, and then only the executor actually has access to some funds other than life cover that might be paying out to start making payments towards insurance, home payments, distributions to the wife, etc. But over and above these institutions, which we have no control over, is knowing where these assets are. So the biggest problem that the executor faces is to find out what this person who passed away owned and what liabilities they had. And that sometimes is even more of a delay than dealing with the master's office. Just imagine if you now have to report an estate of a family member, but you did not know which bank they banked with, where they had shares, which investment house they used for the investments, whether they had offshore assets, etc. It means that as executor, we have to contact each of these financial institutions and wait for the response before we can start administering the estate. Some of the banks have a policy that they have 60 days in which to respond to us. So 60 working days. That does not include weekends. So it means that we are already 3 months down the line before they'll respond. Some of them do respond sooner, but if they're still within the 60 days and we've time push them, they'll say to you, we have 60 days to respond. We're not in breach yet. So that's the type of delay. So for me, there's a lot of things that we can do beforehand to try and streamline that. But that really is the biggest problem of the delays, is not knowing where the assets are. We can work around the financial institutions if we know, just as example, if we know that the client had an account with Investec or with ABSA, we know which bank to go to, and we know who to annoy to no end to get that information. I'm very good at that. But then at least we don't have 5 or 6 institutions that we have to annoy on a daily basis. We have one. So that's the biggest problem that we have with deceased estates, is not knowing the information that we need to, or what we need to resolve at the end.
Gosh, that's so just to understand it correctly. So if I passed away and you didn't know who I banked with, you would go to, let's say, F&B and ABSA and Investec, and each one of those would have 60 days to respond and say, oh, sorry, she's not with us.
Yes, correct.
Wow.
So I have the executor, just to pick it a little bit back to the process of the deceased estate, is obviously once a letter of executorship has been issued, the executor now has to contact all these financial institutions, and the aim is to draft a liquidation and distribution account, which is really a summary of someone's life from a financial perspective. So it will give you all the assets that they owned, if there's any claims against this estate, you mentioned maintenance, if there's any bonds that need to be paid, so all the liabilities, and then obviously the costs and taxes, and then ultimately how the estate will be distributed. And that liquidation distribution account has to be advertised, it has to go through the master's office, it has to go through SARS if there's taxes payable. So the ultimate goal is to have this 5-page document drafted, which is a summary of someone's life. But all the trouble that goes into determining all the information that needs to go into that one account, that's where the delay is. So I can't draft that liquidation and distribution account if I did not know which banks you had in a bank account with, for example. So yes, I will then have to wait for each of these financial institutions to get back to me to say, yes, Shauna had an account with us, or no, Shauna did not have an account with us. And if they say, yes, she had one, I need the balance before I can draft this document. And I think that's the tricky part of it, is just to determine what is there, what do I need to put into this account. If I don't get it right the first time, it means that somewhere along the line, a year, 2, 5 years from now, if there's an asset that pops up, I will have to reopen the estate and do all of this again.
Gosh. Oh my word, that's intense and immense, actually. I had no idea that that you would have to contact everybody. I mean, you know, in your life, you know exactly what you've got, and you think, well, it's just so easy. I mean, I bank with whomever it is that I bank with, and you know, I own my house here and whatever. And it's just quite straightforward. And so I imagine being able to draw up that document ahead of time and just really knowing where everything is so important, actually. So I wanted to, and I think you've answered that in some respects, but is there a way to make this a little bit more efficient and shorter? But actually, just before going on to that, how long does it take to register death with the master's office, and then how long does it take to be appointed an executor, or is it how long is a piece of string?
So yeah, a little bit of both. So if the family knows, for example, where the will is and they have access to some of the information, we don't need to have all the information when reporting the estate. It can happen quickly. So as soon as the death certificate is available, we can draft the documents and send it off to the master's office. We obviously have to have the original will if there's a will, and that all gets lodged with the master. The master is slowly but surely moving with technology and allowing us to do this online, but at this stage, it's a very manual, original document type of situation.
Wow, okay.
Depending on the master's offices, it can take anything from 2 weeks if you're very lucky to 6 months if you're unlucky. We have some of the master's offices where they can't find the file half of the time. So it is a bit of a mission. We are now at the point where we know which master's offices give us problems, and you have to report the estate at the master's office in the jurisdiction where the person lived. So it isn't like I can say, oh, well, Cape Town master's office is fabulous, I'm going to report all my estates at the Cape Town master's office. If someone died in Pretoria, they have to be reported in Pretoria master's office. So yes, in short, anything between 2 weeks to 6 months to get appointed as executor.
Wow, I mean, that's astounding, actually, when you think about somebody who's hasn't planned and their estate has been frozen, they've got no access to money, and they're literally just waiting for a file to be found or a bank to respond. Or, I mean, it really speaks to why you can't just have a will saying, I leave everything to my spouse and that's the end of it, but actually planning for it and going, right, what have we got? So then to my other question, how can you make it efficient and shorter, more efficient and shorter?
So that's the question that myself and my colleagues exactly asked ourselves. We're sitting on the end where we're dealing with the administration and we're dealing with family that's upset and do not always understand the process. So we said there must be something in between that we can better prepare the family of what they can expect, first of all, and where we can better prepare ourselves as executors to go through this process. And what was born was we call the My L&D. So it's My Liquidation Distribution Account. And a lot of my colleagues jokingly call it we kill our clients before they die. Because we then it's terrible. But we take the clients through this whole process to say, listen, if the proverbial bus were to hit you today, what would your estate look like? And we administer the estate while you're sitting next to us, and we can actually ask you the questions. We can ask you, who do you bank with? Okay, let's say you're banking with ABSA, just as an example. Now we know if something happens to you, our first port of call needs to be ABSA. If you say, listen, I've got investments offshore, we actually ask you, what type of investments are there? Who do we need to contact? So all these questions that we try and figure out after death, we now ask upfront. And we draft the liquidation and distribution account, and we make provision for different scenarios. So we either say, if your husband passes away first, what would his estate look like? What are the potential pitfalls? If you pass away first, what are the potential pitfalls for your estate? And we do all this planning and we put it in black and white and we do the calculations. We don't guess the outcome. We show you the outcome. And then you can adjust your will, because then you know, if I put certain clauses into my will, it actually will work. We've tested it. And if something changes along the line, if you decide to sell up a house and go and rent somewhere else, you now have more cash available. We plug that into the calculation and we see the outcome, and then that will determine whether you need to amend your will. Or like you said, you've got minor children now, you need to appoint guardians in your will. In 5 years from now, they're major, they're out on their own. You don't need the guardians. You don't need to make provision. You now need to make provision for elderly parent rather. We change the whole plan. So it's something that grows with you. It's not a once-off exercise and off you go. It grows with you.
Amazing. That's just such an amazing concept. I love it. I mean, I think it, I think going through the process of you passing away is definitely never pleasant, but it's so essential, really, because I think so many things can play out. I had a client who had estate duty. No, her husband had, excuse me, not estate duty, had life insurance payout, but it was paid out to the estate, and the estate was frozen, and she sort of ended up being destitute. So it's really, just how does this work, and what are the nuts and bolts, and where's this going to come from? And yes, you may have many assets, but maybe it's all tied up in property, in which case property is going to have to be sold, and really considering that is so important. So if you did a My L&D, how much faster would the estate wrap up?
So I would say we have tested it. We have had a couple of clients who's gone through the process that's passed away. And in our experience, the estate was finalized between 6 and 8 months from start to finish. we still do need to deal with the master's office. We still need to deal with the banks, and we still need to deal with SARS. But it just means that we can immediately go out the moment that the estate gets reported. We know which assets there are. We can already start the process of, say, getting valuations for cars, houses, all of that, even before we get our appointment, purely because we know which assets there are. So your liquidation distribution account is already drafted. It's there. It's on my screen, and I just need to update the values. It's as pure as that. So it really does simplify matters. Unfortunately, we still need to deal with some delays that's not in our control, but we don't need to phone 100 institutions to find out where someone has their assets.
But gosh, that's a huge decrease in time. I mean, from 3 to 5 years to 6 to 8 months is really kind of what one's anticipating. And I mean, I think of a client of mine now who's her husband, I mean, he was in his 50s when he passed away, and she has been stuck with this problem of trying to wrap up the estate, and she literally has not had time to mourn. It's just been, as my initial story, you know, there's no money, there's no way to pay for the funeral. It's just this dreadful event that seems to have happened, and that she's got no control over. But there are other matters that one needs to consider as well, Leslie, and I made a short list here, and that is, does your spouse have access to emergency funds, and why is that important? And how should your social media accounts be managed after your passing? I didn't even consider that, but yeah. And I think in today's age, more and more, that's so important. Yes. And are there any other important elements that we need to consider?
So, with technology, it's becoming actually more and more difficult, because usually you will have one of the spouses who's mainly responsible for paying bills, settling the municipal bill, paying Vodacom, paying insurance, etc. And that's all on your email. And the other partner doesn't always have access to your emails. Right. So it becomes really a big problem to access the latest municipal bill, bank statements, investment statements, all of it. It's all electronic. You know, I previously would have a client walk in with a little basket full of paper, and you could at least go file through it and say, okay, well, here's the Vodacom statement, but now everything is online, and you don't have access to it. So I think it's actually going through your whole life as part of the MyLND, over and above just the big things. It's going through what needs to be paid on a monthly basis, and how do I access that? If my spouse, who's mainly responsible for making all these payments, how do I know what needs to be paid at the end of the month, and how do I access this? How do I contact Vodacom to say, no, please change debit order now to my bank account? So it's really, it's a very cliche saying, but knowledge is power, and that will make your life a lot easier. We tend to not want to talk about this because it's an uncomfortable discussion, and it's something that we don't want to think about, but it is a reality. And I promise you, you will sleep a lot better at night if you have this, and if you have a little plan, and you have a little file with everything in, who to contact, and that file can be in your bookshelf, or it can be with us, or it can be electronic, and your family have access to it. You can have access to it. Your children can have access to it. Your accountant can have access to it. But it's really starting somewhere and putting all of this information together.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's just essential with any planning, really, is to have that plan, is to have thought it through, really. So I think when talking about estate planning, it really is such a complicated event. And I had in my notes here that I wanted to just stop this broadcast briefly with a little story about a woman whose multimillionaire husband suddenly passed away. And she was married in a community of property. And so the entire estate was immediately frozen, which meant she couldn't access any bank accounts or any funds at all. Her children had to send her money to pay for the funeral. And just a reminder there, her husband was a multi-millionaire. So it wasn't like there wasn't sufficient cash. There definitely was sufficient cash, but there wasn't planning around it. It hadn't been thought through. The estate took 5 years to wrap up. And correct me if I'm wrong, Leslie, but this lady would have been unable to access any funds whatsoever until the estate was completely wrapped up. And I think what I'm alluding to there is, what does it mean to have an estate wrapped up?
Yeah. So first of all, she was married in community of property. So quite a number of years ago, if you were married in community of property, it meant that all the assets, including your personal bank accounts, would be frozen. That has since then changed. So luckily, if in her case, her own bank accounts would still be available to her, but that depends on whether she had money in them. So if it was her husband paying all the bills and all the main cashes in his bank accounts, his bank accounts would have been frozen, and she wouldn't have had access to that until the executor was appointed, and the executor could get the bank to pay the funds over into his bank, the estate late bank account, from where the executor could then start paying costs on behalf of the estate. So your executor really steps into the shoes of the deceased, taking over those responsibilities, paying for bonds, etc., if there is cash available. That's the other question. So from her point of view, if she was the sole beneficiary of his estate and there were cash in the estate late account and the executor was comfortable that there was sufficient liquid assets to pay for the costs and the expenses of the estate, the executor could make interim distributions to her to carry on and pay groceries and pay for her lifestyle. If, however, if she was not the sole beneficiary, so if her husband decided to bequeath his whole estate to family trusts, as example, the executor would be very restricted in being able to give her money during the process.
Right.
Yes, they will still have to pay for the estate expenses that the husband that passed away and used to pay for, but he wouldn't be able to just say pay 500,000 rand out to her because she's not the sole beneficiary of the estate. So, and that's all the things that come out in planning to say from a tax point of view, it made perfectly sense, perhaps the way it was structured, but it also needed to make sense for the family and their needs. And I think that's where the big problem comes in, is that for a lot of people are focused on, one, I have a will, so that's that box ticked, it's signed, it's sealed, it's somewhere in a safe. And then, yes, I've got all these structures in place and it's tax efficient, but tax efficient does not mean it's efficient for your family. So in her case, if she had known what they were, and even if there were liabilities or assets that need to be sold to generate liquidity, at least she would have known what to expect. Yeah. Have a little bit of, to say, listen, this is going to take some time to sell assets, have a bit of spare cash in my own bank account that I can access to pay for my daily expenses until we get to the stage where we can sell an asset. And the problem with selling fixed property, sorry, I'm venturing a little bit off your question.
That's okay.
But just to, like with selling this, assets, is I can get a buyer the day after someone passes away, but I still have to be appointed as executor before I can sign the document. And that transfer can only take place once we've lodged a liquidation distribution account and received approval from the master that we may proceed. So even if we have an immediate buyer, the transfer can't go through until you have the necessary consents in place.
So if I put that into the timeline, so we've got 2 weeks to 6 months to get the executor or the executor passed on from the master. Yeah. And then you've got to do the liquid and distribution account, but you don't know where this person banks. So you've got to do 60 days, 60 days, 60 days. Yes. And hopefully find out. Then you draw up the letter of the liquid and distribution account and you submit it. And only after that can you possibly sell a property. Meanwhile, people are running out of cash. Am I understanding that correctly? So
selling a property, most of the time you can sell during the process. You have to get the master's approval to sell the property. If it's sold out of the estate for liquidity purposes, it can be sold, but the master still has to consent to the sale, and then registration, depending on what the conditions of the sale are. Let's say everything moves smoothly, the buyer's got his bond, everything that needs to go through the deeds office, and then the cash comes in. Then only have the cash to start paying something, and then finalize the estate. So you asked, what does it mean to wrap up estate? It means that there's no more bank accounts in the deceased's name. There's no more investments in their name. That the last tax returns have been filed. That SARS is happy that all the taxes are up to date. And sometimes SARS goes back in 7 years and says, oh, 7 years ago, there was no tax return submitted. Please do that before you move along. So it's all of those things that need to be done. and only then, once it's advertised, distributed, the estate late bank accounts on zero, then the master will release you from your duties as executor. So sometimes you finish the estate and you get to the point where we say, oh, we're happy, it's 8 months, we now can distribute to all the beneficiaries, but there's probably another 4 or 5 months after that before we can really say that the estate's wound up, because we still have to, as executor, have to go back to the master and prove that we've done what we were supposed to do.
It's just unbelievably long. I mean, you kind of just wish that nobody would ever die, really. I mean, apart from the fact that it's enormously traumatic, you just, that really is just such a long process. So I think planning is really, yeah, and it's so essential. So I have a number of people who say, and this happens all the time. I speak to clients, and I ask them about their estate planning, and I ask them about whether their wills are in place, and they all come back and say, oh yeah, absolutely, everything's sorted, don't worry, totally sorted out. And in my experience, Leslie, I would have to say that probably 1%, maybe not even 1% of my clients actually have everything sorted out. I was just wondering if that's the same for you. But also further to that, I think with Carrick, Athena, what I've come across as well is that many women don't have a seat at the financial decision-making table, as we know. And when they go to their spouses, they get faced with a similar response to what I do when I ask my clients, and that is, honey, is everything sorted with regards to our estate planning? And the answer is, yes, of course it is. And that's all they get. And there's no way of knowing whether it is. And if you think about the consequences of not knowing, if you are going to be the wife who's left alone with no money because everything's tied up in bank accounts or whatever the case is, as we've discussed, all these various factors come into play. I mean, you need to be able to ask those questions. You need to be able to get a thorough and proper answer. So my question is there a way that you can advise women to approach their spouses to make sure that actually everything is sorted and it's organized and that they're not going to be left destitute?
Well, for me, it's a very uncomfortable situation, an uncomfortable conversation to have, especially if the husband says, "Don't worry, you'll be cared for." I've heard that so many times, and even when I'm doing the mile ND and I'm sitting with the husband, he's like, "I just want everything to be sorted for my wife." So they will have the best intentions, but it's actually asking the pertinent questions to say, "Thank you so much. I'm glad everything is sorted. What does that mean?" And in real terms. So one is, where's the will? If the proverbial bus hits you, who do I call? That's the starting point. So, and then where are the assets? Who do I need to contact? So is there someone specific that will have oversight of all your assets and all your affairs that I can go to one person? And how does that impact me? Because your stats are actually hectic to say that there's 74% of women that will end up alone or dying alone.
Yeah.
It means that there's a number of years that a wife or a mom will have to cope on their own. And that's a realistic thing. So it's really not being almost, I would say, I'm struggling to find the right word, but like saying, don't worry, don't you stress about it, I've sorted it out. Tell them, yes, I am stressing about it. I'm even more stressing about it when you tell me don't stress about it. I want to know and ask specific questions. Ask things like, do you have life cover? Where is it? Who does it pay to? Where do I pay? If I have to pay everything that you're paying right now, where do I get the money to get that? How do I know what you're paying on a monthly basis? So it's almost having a little bit of a checklist to go through. And if that's a very difficult conversation for you to have on your own, get a professional involved to sit down with both of you and say, listen, as executor, someone who's gone through many and many estates and administering them and seeing what could go wrong, help us to navigate through these questions, because it is hard. It is a difficult question. And it's sometimes, I mean, it's speaking about husband and wife, but it's also a conversation to have with your parents. Because you might be 100% planned and structured and everything. And now suddenly there's an inheritance coming from a parent or a grandparent that you haven't planned on. And I promise you the conversation with your husband will look a lot less stressful if once you try and have this conversation with your father to ask him, so what did you do to the planning? So, but it's really, it is, it's something where you have to be assertive and not just accept everything on face value, to say, I need to know what's happening. And so if you as the wife, I'm saying for myself, I do most of the payments. And I just realized one day that I was flying to Joburg, and I was realized, well, if this plane does not make it to Joburg, my husband won't even know how to pay the school fees. He doesn't even know where to go. And I was like, oh, heck, I'm preaching this to everyone else. I need to do this. And we've now got a little bit of a system where we share the information. We don't need to check up on it every single day, but he knows he could log on and he can see what payments need to go off, who to contact for insurance, etc. And I think that's the conversation that you need to have. It's the nitty-gritty things to everyday life that's going to make your life difficult if something happens to your partner.
I think, and what I'm really hoping with these podcasts and the webinars and the seminars that we're hosting for women is for them to just also have stories that they can relate to, you know, like
Yes.
the story of this woman whose husband was a multimillionaire and said everything was okay, and actually it wasn't. But to try and find a more subtle approach to asking these important people in our lives how things are set up and how it works. And to have an online checklist, you know, and maybe there's a matter of starting by creating and saying, okay, look, this is what I've done for with regards to the kids and the things that I'm taking care of. I've put this online. Can we do this as well for your side of what it is that you're taking care of, so that I understand and so that I can be sure that I know what to do and where to go, because it is a little bit derogatory, I suppose, to just say it's all fine, don't worry, I've taken care of you. It's you know, it's a bit degrading because it and disempowering, and I think that whole process is exactly what one wants to try and get around, an empowerment of the individual. So I also come across a number of people who assign family members as executors, and after all that you've just told me, I really hope that nobody in my family has secretly assigned me as an executor, because I wouldn't know where to begin. I mean, I don't think they have. So maybe that also speaks to another question. Can somebody secretly assign you as an executor and you don't know what's coming? And what are your thoughts on family members being executors?
Sure, we probably have to have another hour for webinar to have this argument. So yes, you can assign a family member or nominate a family member as executor in your will. The master, unless your family member is an attorney or part of a trust company or an accountant with experience, the master, when the estate gets reported, will insist on the family member appointing an agent, which will be a bank, a financial institution, an attorney, accountant, someone with experience administering estates. So a lot of people, the one argument for appointing a family member as executor is that they say that the family member can go and negotiate and get quotes from quite a number of people to bring down the executor's fees as low as possible. It is true, but now you also expect a family member who is emotional. If your husband, for example, nominated you as the wife, as the executor, you have all of these things that you have to deal with that we've just discussed, and getting insurance and the grocery money and all of that together. And now you still have to go out and find someone to administer the estate. You go and you will get quotes from different people, and it just ends up delaying the actual reporting of the estate by so much if you have to go and shop around. I've had clients who reported the estate 14 months after the person passed away. Wow. Which means that we're already 14 months down the line of things being frozen and not happening. It makes a big mess. So I'm for appointing a financial institution, someone that can't pass away either. I've just dealt with an estate where the nominated executor passed away before the person passed away, which then is another delay.
Okay.
Or, for me, it's just appointing someone that's got the experience, that knows which master's office delays matters, to know that you have to report the estate with SARS and get a tax number for the estate, those little things. So I'm for appointing a professional person, and then nothing stops you as the individual of negotiating that fee up front while you're here. Why do you want to leave that to your family to negotiate the fee? Negotiate the fee now. And then I've done and dusted, your family knows exactly who to go to, where the will is kept, what the fee is going to be, etc. So I'm pro for that. I know there's a lot of people that have the thought to say there's an appointed family member, and I'm not opposed to that. It can work, but you are expecting a lot from your family member as well to now go out and take responsibility for all of this. They will have to appoint an agent in any way, and there's going to be a fee involved in any way.
Yeah, I didn't realize that they had to appoint an agent
Yeah.
anyway. And then it kind of just, takes, you sort of wonder, well, why are you even bothering to do that? And I also think that what a lot of clients don't realize is that there are very real costs in wrapping up an estate. There's the advertising to creditors, there's somebody standing in the queue at the master's office, there's all the various aspects that you spoke to. And so if we go again back to the beginning of the podcast, where you have this one little letter with the bank because it was a free will saying, I've left everything to my spouse. You're kind of doing yourself quite a disservice there. The bank, as we know, doesn't have necessarily a vested interest in wrapping this up very quickly. So trying to just finalize that as fast as possible is really essential, and it's quite important to address at the beginning.
Absolutely.
So, Leslie, after everything we've discussed today and all our attendees who've come and joined us today, is there anything else that you would like to add to this process, or anything else that you think needs to be taken into consideration with wrapping up an estate and possibly doing a MyLND?
I think it's just having the understanding that, one, you're doing a will and signing a will is not estate planning. The will should be at the tail end of the planning. It is making sure that you know exactly how you are married, where the assets are, and have a general understanding if there's any structures. Maybe I've got to mention as well, a lot of the men have business interests, businesses that they run on their own. What happens to that business if he passes away? So it is asking the questions, being assertive, and making sure that you have the knowledge to assist you. And even if there is a problem that you can foresee if your husband passes away, if you are aware of that problem, you can prepare yourself. So it is really spending time. It's like going and having your hair done or your nails done. It's something that you need to do for yourself. Is get this plan sorted, because you will never ever regret doing it. So for me, it's really just going out there, standing your ground, asking the right questions, and making sure that you have the necessary knowledge to take you if something, or assist you if something happens along the line.
I couldn't agree with you more. Every client that I've done an MyLND with, it's been amazing. Every single one, without fail, we found something that just doesn't work.
Yeah.
Like, it's just not tying up. It doesn't make sense. And what's amazing about it is that we can then fix it.
Yes.
And that situation never occurs. It's actually seamless, and it's straightforward, and it's done. And it's been strange things that one wouldn't really anticipate at all, that has thrown the whole estate planning process out. So yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing what it brings to light, actually.
No, absolutely. And also it just gives you that peace of mind in the evening when you lay your head down, to not stress about that. To say, like, that's the one thing I don't need to worry about, because we've done the plan, and I can worry about the school run tomorrow and whether I'll be on time. But so yeah, it's just giving you that peace of mind if you have everything in one place and you know what to expect.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, having that seat at the financial decision-making table, I know I talk about it over and over again, but I just cannot stress it enough. As women, in our the webinar that we did recently on marital regimes, not knowing how your marital regime is going to affect this passing of, when your husband passes away, how that's going to affect you, not understanding that and not knowing how their state wraps up and how you're going to continue your life going forward in such a difficult time is just so important. We need to be able to unpack that. And life has so many pivotal moments, and it's just this one isn't any easier than any of the rest. It's really complicated. So you might find, I think, as an individual, that your confidence levels during this particular stage of life are really shot. You feel like you're not going to make the right decision. You feel concerned, you're grieving, your best friend has left. It's just so important that we really understand how things are going to play out. You almost want this to just be automatic and not to think about it. And I think communication is so key, as you said, Leslie, sitting down and understanding how the process is going to unfold, where things are, what's going to happen is just so essential. We don't want to have those stories of these women who just didn't know what was going to happen or what the assets were, or the fact that there was an enormous amount of debt and there's actually nothing left over.
Yeah.
I had a client who came up to me, and her husband actually said to her, "Oh, don't worry about it. I've got everything sorted. When we retire, there's enough money." And it turned out that he just didn't have enough money when he retired, and she had to carry on working. And I know that that's not a death, but it was the same story. She took it for granted that everything was sorted out. So I just wanted to thank you, Leslie, for your time today, for joining us, and for all the incredible insight and information and help you've given to countless clients who've gone through this process and just making their lives, honestly, that little bit better and really shortening this incredible lengthy process that they have to go through. It's crazy. It's just yeah. But thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. And I just wanted to extend an invitation to our attendees today. If there's any more information that you'd like to know about or have or receive with regards to this process, then please do get in contact with us. We're very happy to share it with you. Thank you for joining us.